The second major patch of TFT Cyber City is here, and with it, a huge shakeup of the metagame. There's a new set of comps that are at the top, there are new comps being played overall, and some stuff that was previously terrible is actually pretty dang good if you know the right conditions. So let's go ahead and hop into the TFT Academy tier list and find out who are the best comps and how do we play them. My first recommendation this patch is to look if you can play a Ginsu's Rageblade opener onto a bunch of different compositions. The first composition that should be in your mind at every game is, can I play Zeri? Zeri is the dominant composition this patch, and she can support 3 players in the top 4 as long as you hit Hollow Bow. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in a moment, but just look to see if you have Hollow Bow in your Exotech, and if you can, try to see if you can angle towards Rageblade and play towards Zeri. But the really good thing about Rageblade is you can still carry some of the best reroll comps in the composition for top 4. Vayne and Slayer's reroll is really, really good. You can always play Twist of Fate. And there's even some variations where if you have range extension for Shaco, you can also put Rageblade on him. If all else fails, there are some variations you can play of Aphelios as well. So you have some outs of your outs, which is really, really nice. The second item that people should pay attention to is Blue Buff. Blue Buff is really good with Cyberboss Veigar reroll, and that is the strongest AP reroll line in the game. And it also gives you really powerful outs with Vex. Vex is the best 4-cost user of Blue Buff, but you also have some outs with Annie. It's kind of off meta to play around Vex and Annie currently, but you definitely can do that. And Vex is the new comp that a lot of people are spamming, specifically in EU, to get a lot of easy LP. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Spear of Shojin is still a very versatile item. It is, the jack of all trades, master of none, except it's like worse this patch because, Anima Squad's a lot worse, Misfortune is worse. So it feels like less of a jack of all trades. I guess whatever is lower than that, Jester of all trades. It's sort of the king of B tier and good on brand, but you don't even really care about it in Slayers. You don't really care about it in Zeri. It's just like a leftover item in Zeri. So Shojin is like significantly weaker this patch. And then Infinity Edge is actually another item that is similar to Shojin, except that you do really want one Infinity Edge in Zeri. But for the most part, it's just an item for a bunch of B tier comps. So it's a lot weaker this patch as well. It's nice though to have Infinity Edge for secondary carries in some of these other compositions. The number 1 comp this patch is Hollow Bow Exotech Zeri. Every time you start the game, you should be scouting to see if you have an Exotech item in Hollow Bow included in 357. And then trying to prioritize Rageblade, Infinity Edge, and Hollow Bow on Zeri. The reason why is because they buffed Hollow Bow a lot, and every time Zeri spams a clone with her ability, she ends up stacking Hollow Bow, getting more and more crit strike chance and converting that into damage. If you get something like Bad Luck Protection with Hollow Bow in particular, it ends up creating a really nasty stack combo where she gets something like 400 AD, and that means every time she's attacking, she's dealing 400 base AD, and she melts a bunch of front lines. The interaction is going to get nerfed in the next patch, guaranteed. I believe Riot said specifically that that's probably too powerful. So make sure when you scout your Exotech and you see a bunch of Hollow Bow, you angle for this as much as you can. The cool thing about Exotech is that you don't have to always play 7. 7 is just an easy number to hit because you just play 7 Exotech plus, Kindred and 5 costs or whatever else you want to flex. But you can actually move down to 5 Exotech if you have Hollow Bow, for example, at the second breakpoint. Like if you don't have Hollow Bow at number 7 for the 3rd item, and instead it's given them the first 2 items, you can cut into Fury and Varus for other really high power 5 costs like Zac, Aurora, and Viego. Those are some of the best ways to cap out the board. And so in reality, something that makes Exotech even stronger is that Zeri will carry all of stage 3, 4, and parts of 5, and then you can get to the 5 cost, roll at 9, and just fit your board with powerful legendaries. Exotech also scales really well off of items, so if you were to take something like Buried Treasures, Binary Airdrop, Trade Tracker, get all those extra free items, you equip all of your units and it turns them to super tanks. Like Jax with 3 random emblems off Trade Tracker ends up just having so much HP that he ends up tanking like a 3-star unit, and same thing with Neferi and Mordekaiser. If you're looking for a duo carry, just put random AD items on Jhin, things like Shojin, Deathblade, Last Whisper, Infinity Edge. He can also take the second offensive Exotech item as well, so if you have something like a Hyperfang, just put it on Jhin. And I have to mention the combo, if you somehow get the Exodia, which is Hollow Bow, Rageblade, and Pulse Stabilizer, some games you're going to get this lineup of Exotech items. Pulse Stabilizer, to summarize it, is basically Infinity Edge plus Gold Collector. The ability to execute makes her extremely efficient because she attacks fast, and she's going to deal so much damage and ends up being an amazing spike. So definitely go for all three of these if you can. I will say that Exotech Emblem is surprisingly not important in this line, so definitely don't prioritize it nearly as much as you prioritize things like items and econ. Sejuani takes leftover tank, but make sure you try to build her tier-based tank items. So Redemption, Protector's Vow, and Adaptive are her best because you just want her to cast her blue screen as soon as possible. The more mana she's able to get while staying tanky, the better. Cypher still remains on S tier. It's the only composition from the previous patch to stay in this tier of power, and that's because they actually buffed Cypher Cashouts to be more consistent, and they didn't really nerf anything else about the composition. I guess the best way that this got nerfed is that Sejuani and Zeri end up being really contested, so the Exotech package is really hard to nail down. The way people have adapted is that they go for Galio 3 as their main tank because it's also a reroll meta, so they're trying to roll for 3 stars. You just go for Draven 3 and Galio 3. Senna 3 is really hard to hit because of Slayers, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And because you get so many extra resources through Cypher that you just end up overwhelming your opponents. But it is a little bit less consistent compared to where it was previously, so it's not the best comp in the game. The other thing about Cypher, though, is that people are mainly playing this just as a resource mechanic to cash out into anything. And so philosophically, Cypher is also S tier because you can just play Cypher Lose Streak and then cash out to play into any composition that's just very expensive. There's a new section of TFT Academy with guides. We put up the Cypher guide to help actually talk about exactly this. For example, one thing that people had done previous patches was to play Artifact cash out and then just pivot into like a reroll, just sell every Cypher unit and reroll into Rengar or someone else. You can also just sell this cash out and play into a fast 9 strategy. This was the Strategist Amp board played previously, but you can also just cut Yuumi and Annie and play, you know, Brand Ziggs, plus the usual stuff. So don't feel beholden to have to reroll Draven and Galio when you play Cypher. It's just the easiest thing to do because you don't have to sell the Cypher units and you can keep most of them in while transitioning your board. I think one mistake that people often make is that they think Draven 3 by himself is stable, but you really do need a duo carry. Zed is the most consistent just because you're rolling on 8, so it's easy to hit Zed 2. And Zeri's hyper contested, so you're unlikely to hit. But in the reality, you just try to have Draven itemized, Zed itemized, maybe Renekton holds random Thief Skulls or other items. If you have Center 3, give her random items. You just try to like win through overwhelming amount of resources and carries. And the one thing I'll say is that level 9 actually doesn't do that much for this composition. If you go level 9, you're probably just going to play, you know, some kind of really powerful 5 cost, maybe Aurora, for example. But it's not like you're trying to rush to 9. So I see a lot of people hit Draven 3, but they have Galio 1, Sejuani 1, Zeri 1, Zed 1, and they're like, oh, I cashed out, I should be really strong. You probably need to roll on 8 a lot more in order to stabilize because, you know, you have to reroll, and if you're not able to actually hit your upgrade, you're going to struggle a lot. Slayer reroll is really strong this patch and consistent because Jarvan got massive buffs. This guy is a unit. I can't believe how powerful he is, even just at 2-star. He does everything now. He does damage, he tanks, he AoEs. He also adds utility by reducing armor every time he sweeps, which is really nice. And so people actually build Jarvan not just as a tank, but sometimes even just give him carry items because he can just hit really hard. In fact, there's a Chinese variation of this that people build just straight up Zed items on Jarvan, like Infinity Edge, Hand of Justice, Bloodthirster. And then he just swipes everything and potentially one-shots any 1-star boards. One thing that's really important about Vayne in particular is that I think a lot of people misunderstand that you need to roll on 7 for this composition, not 6. The reason why you roll on 7 is because you need access to not just the 3 costs that are important to the composition like Jarvan and Senna, and those are your maximum mods, but you also really want the 4 costs. Zed and Leona are really nice to have, and by rolling on 7 over time, you'll just like naturally pick them up. Your odds for 2 costs are also not that bad on 7. They're still pretty solid, so you should be able to pick up Vayne. And like I said, it's actually more about like Slayers and less about just Vayne reroll. Even though we have her picture here, we call it Slay Queen, it's still really important to grab everybody else because it's sort of the sum of its parts. By playing the core 4 Slayer, 4 Vanguard, you should be very stable both in stage 3 and stage 4 as long as you have upgrades. This composition requires infinite bows. It's actually really hard to get all of these bows. If you look, theoretically, you want, 5 bows here, but just try to get double Rage Blade on Vayne plus 1 other item. So sometimes you go Giant Slayer, you sometimes go Death Blade, Ruined Hurricane. It's just really hard to guarantee the best in the slot Vayne. But that's why you play it off of things like component anvils, because then you're able to get it started early. Maybe you also find, Pandoras or other ways to get those guaranteed items. But you really want combat power as well. Combat power is really important because that ultimately what takes this composition over the top. And then one mistake I see a lot of people do is try to over prioritize like what is best in slot Z. Just throw whatever items make sense. So when we put 2 items here, it's like he just takes leftover items. Same thing with Senna. So just give them whatever is left over. On level 8, usually you add in Renekton or Garen, but you can really flex in any 5 cost or even just Divinicore just to add in a little bit more meat. Then the last thing I want to note is that this positioning example is very intentional because this counters the normal way people position Sejuani. A lot of times if you look at Sejuani, people always put her somewhere in like the 2nd or 3rd hex from the edge. So A2, A3 or A5, A6. And that's because they want Sejuani to ult with her blue screen towards the corner unit, because that's where people position their carries. If you position here and Sejuani is in front of Jarvan or to the top right of Jarvan, then she's going to aim at the Jarvan, and that circle radius is actually going to miss Vayne. It'll catch Senna most of the time, if not every time, but it'll actually ult everything in this little circle and miss Vayne in the corner. And that's really important because the way you lose fights late game is for Vayne to get chain CC'd. Or she gets targeted by assassins. And so eliminate that possibility by positioning like this is going to be really, really important. But it doesn't exactly work if you flip it, because if you go on the other side, let's say you put all these units on the right and Vayne on the left, you see the circle radius actually might catch Vayne anyways, because the way the hexes are actually misaligned. It's not exactly symmetrical in TFT. The way you counter this, if you are the Sejuani player playing on the other side, is actually to put Sejuani right here on the far right, because then she'll guarantee walk up, and I believe that she still should ult Vayne. But the problem with positioning Sejuani to try to counter the Vayne positioning is that it makes her way less consistent against a lot of other people. So I would only suggest doing that if you know 100% you're going up against the Vayne player and 100% they're going to position like this. So there's layers, there's levels of how you position, and that's going to swing a bunch of fights. So just use that information accordingly. Cyberboss Veigar is the strongest AP reroll composition in the game, and this is thanks to Veigar getting a big bug fix change on Jewel Gauntlet in particular. In the previous patch, Veigar actually didn't work with Jewel Gauntlet. It like inversed his crit, and so it actually like reduced your chances of actually dealing more damage. But this patch, they fixed that. And now Jewel Gauntlet is very, very, very powerful on Veigar. So just simply replace the Gunblade. You can go blue buff, Nashers, and Jewel Gauntlet. You can actually still play Gunblade variations. I've seen blue buff, Nashers, Gunblade still work pretty well, but it's just that Jewel Gauntlet caps him really high, and now he can deal massive, massive damage. If you do have Piercing Lotus, because it gives your ability the chance to strike now, you don't actually need the Jewel Gauntlet. They do basically the same thing. That's where you can go for like the big cap, Gunblade with Nashers and other AP sources. Best augment for this composition still is new high score, but I've seen people take Cower Weaklings, Starry Knights, just the usual reroll stuff, and just generally have a lot of power. Another thing about this composition is that Ziggs is actually kind of important to put items on, and maybe that's probably something we have to edit in, just put more items on Ziggs. You do want to duo carry, even though you're about Veigar. So after you're finished itemizing, your tank, in a lot of cases, you're trying to go for Shyvana, Poppy in the early game, then transition later to Kabuko. You eventually want to put third items on Ziggs, and you want them to hold things like Shiv, Red Buff, Death Cap, Archangels, another Jewel Gauntlet, for example, because Ziggs is really important. There's also like a big gap after Veigar, Poppy, Shyvana plus Mordekaiser. You're going to notice that okay, I don't have Viego and Kabuko, and I don't have Ziggs. These are only 4 units. Where's the rest of the composition? It's because you can actually play a bunch of flex spots. You can play more Bastions in the mid game. You can play more Techies in the mid game. You can throw in Strategists. You can play like Echo and Nico and Zyra Brand. You actually have so many different things that you can do. And so this is actually really interesting. Veigar might be one of the more flexible reroll lines we've seen in quite some time because you don't actually have to play the same units every game. You can really mix and match. I would say that the Street Demon version is probably the most consistent just because it gives you a ton of overall stats, and it's just generally the best AP shell. The problem is Nico and Strategists are some of the most contested frontline in the game, so it's just really hard to consistently get that. The Bastion variation is viable, but I do think that's something you peel off of, and no matter what, you're always selling those units for Viego and Kabuko late game anyways. And then the final shout out I want to give out is Mana Zane on Veigar is disgusting. If you end up getting Mana Zane on Veigar, Just make sure that Veigar is positioned in front of the weak units, and you can just watch him one-tap everything. It's very, very satisfying. Speaking of the AP core shell, Strategist brand is very powerful in the current meta. This is the best way to play like a Shojin AP opener. If you slam tier and rod-based items, you're often thinking about what to play. Most people angle for Strategist brand. It plays really well with 5 costs. If you're able to get to Brand 2, Ziggs 2, and Viego, you should win most games as if you upgrade everything. And you also have some late game flexibility in your package. You know, this is the easiest version to play. You have Samira and Zyra as your strategist, but you can actually cut both of these units, go down from 5 to 3 Street Demon, and then instead play, for example, 2 more Cyberboss. You could play a Veigar, which keeps your 4 techie, and then you could play Poppy to get the 4 Cyberboss in. That's one variation you can play that a lot of people like. You can also play other high value 5 costs, like a stacked Zac 2 is insane in this composition alongside an Aurora. She's never bad. You can also play a second Viego and watch him really do a lot of damage. You can tech in Annie and Yumi if you want to go for strategist, and maybe you're not hitting Ziggs. So you play brand Annie, and then you have Annie hold a bunch of those items. And then Annie is Golden Axe that ties to Viego. So you have so many different variations you can play. It's AP flex, but at the core, you still need brand, Nico, Echo, ideally Viego, Mordekaiser, and then because you're playing Mordekaiser, you might as well tie him with Kabuko as well. The composition is insanely expensive. That's why a lot of people end up playing something like Cypher and then trying to cash out into brand strategist because it's just very, very expensive. If you're playing on Scuttlepuddle or Gold Subscription or other high resource encounters, you can look for this. And you also want a ton of items. You want items for Kabuko. You want items for Ziggs brand. You want to itemize Viego. If you have Samira 2 on your board, you want to give her items as well because she can do things, especially if you get like Infinity Edge Last Whisper. So you just need like a ton of stuff. And that's one of the big drawbacks about this composition. It's just really expensive. And if you're contested, it's even more pricey. So just try to play this with caution because I think a lot of people end up gassing out at level 8. They roll so much and they hit Brand 2, Nico 1, Ziggs 2, but they're not able to get to 9. They can't get to Legendaries online, and they just fizzle out. 2 really powerful artifacts with Brand, Mana Zane and Sniper's Focus. Just play that and replace the Guard Breaker. So you go like Shojin Jewel Gauntlet, play that, and just watch them blow everything up. The new composition that started Surge post-patch is Vex Exotech, aka Vexotech. It's a very fun variation where you play Vex as the primary carry and you play a Exotech shell around her to give her front line. Variations of Vex actually existed while you play Divinicore Vex. So you guys actually look at like the Divinicore Z variation that we actually have shown. It's similar to this where you play like Vex as the blue buff and then you carry Z. But the problem with something like this is that Divinicore actually doesn't have a true tank. Gragas is not a reliable tank. Jarvan is really contested unless you 3-star him and you're not playing a lot of Vanguards. And the reason why Divinicore works is because it's sort of like stacking Zed as your carry and your tank. But because of 5 Exotech giving a bunch of HP every time you stack items, you can actually make Mord and Sejuani a pretty beefy frontline, and that stalls enough for Vex to actually do a bunch of damage. And the reason why Vex is really good with that strong frontline is because of Gunblade. Gunblade heals the lowest percent ally for 20% of the damage dealt, and then you combine that with her passive, gain 50% Omnivamp, 150% of overhealing from Retribution's damage is converted to bonus true damage to its primary target. And that bonus true damage is insane when you stack it with the fact that she's casting a lot with blue buff. Blue buff is her best mana item, so you definitely want blue buff and Gunblade. And then you combine that with other augments. Maybe you have something like a Sated Spellweaver or health as well to get a bunch of Omnivamp. Her overheal is going to start pushing out thousands of true damage very quickly. Third item on Vex is less important in the stats. I think people really like Giant Slayer. You can also go for Jewel Gauntlet, Guard Breaker. If you do have Guard Breaker, you really need to activate Executioner because Executioner is kind of like the Jewel Gauntlet effect. Normally, when you have Jewel Gauntlet and Executioner, that's like redundant, but I think Vex just cares so much about the crit itself that maximizing her crit chance is actually kind of good. The other 2 pieces of this composition that's really important is to stack your frontline unit. Usually Mordekaiser is actually a much more reliable tank because Sejuani is so contested. You get the Corrupted Chassis, that's his best Exotech item. Throw actual tank items on Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser 3 is really hard to hit, but if you do get it, you are very good spot. And then you throw whatever left over on Varus. So Hollow Bow is his best item. Give him things like Morello, Red Buff, and then Shiv, Deathcap, Shojin, whatever you want. Varus items, just whatever's left over. Early game, I think Morgana is a really good carry of blue buff in particular because you see her short circuit is 40 mana. That's really good with blue buff. Really good synergy there. The only downside is that Gunblade kind of sucks as an early game item, but it's so important for Vex. So if you're making blue buff Gunblade, you're actually not going to win very many fights because Gunblade's like an item that does really well in the late stage of the game, but early game, you're not getting that many offensive stats and you're not dealing that much damage. So not too much synergy. So it's not very good early game item. But I promise you, once you get to level 8 and you hit Vex 2 and your front line, you will be good to go. The last thing I want to say about this is that the composition actually doesn't have to play 5 Exotech. In the late stages of the game, I'm pretty sure downgrading to 3 Exotech and playing high value 5 costs like Renekton and Viego can be really good for the composition. In an ideal world, you cut down on Jhin and Jax. You replace Jax with another Bastion Renekton, and then Jhin is the Viego that ties in to the Techie from Morgana. And then you have such an insane late game board that you can actually win lobbies. But that's only once you get to 9, and once you have stabilized and actually have like a good front line with Vex, and then you can itemize things like the Viego. But the main weakness of this composition is that your core is contested. Sejuani is going to be really hard to hit. You do have other options if you want to play into this. You could try to play Bruisers, and you also could try to play around Divinicore, but those are just less consistent. 2 augments I really want to count in particular. I think Board of Directors is insane in exactly something like this, where you really amplify Vex as your main unit, and because you're playing Morgana and Vex and Gragas, they have really good synergy to keep your frontline alive, maximize your AP and crit. Seiya's Spellweaver, I think, is like a true combo with Hextech Gunblade and Retribution on her passive. So that's also something to pay attention to. And then Spirit Link is just really good whenever you're trying to play a beefy front line with sustain. Whenever you're trying to play like a Gunblade, sustain the front line, Spirit Link ends up having really good synergy with that. And it also stat checks a bunch of people if they don't have anti-heal. Shaco Reroll is also back on the menu. This guy terrorized PB. He was really, really strong. And he is basically another variation of Slayer Reroll because they buff Shaco and they buff Jarvan. You don't actually have to itemize Jarvan, though. I mean, he's the most common unit to itemize. But, you know, for example, Braum 3 is much more likely to be hit because he's less contested, unless you have a Twisted Fate player in your lobby. So you can try to go for, like, Braum 3. Just tank whoever you're able to ultimately hit. Shaco ends up taking a bunch of sword items. So Edge of Night and Infinity Edge, maybe even Bloodthirster are pretty good on him. But you do ultimately want him to crit because he gets so much AD off of the amount of kills that he gets. A lot of times in the early game, you actually just have Shaco 2 with items and you slam it. And if you win, lose, it is what it is. In fact, you probably prefer to try to win streak because the more kills you get, the more likely he is to kill in the future. Tempo also matters a lot with Shaco, meaning that if you econ up to 50 gold and then you slow roll above 50 gold all throughout stage 3 and you hit at the end of stage 3, that's too late. Shaco really wants to be 3-star so you can win fights decisively and get that permanent AD. So he's actually one of the few units you truly hyper roll for, which is if you're close to Shaco, roll until you hit Shaco 3 because you have to max your odds and you want to win stage 3. Shaco's also an amazing, amazing user of a bunch of artifacts. In fact, I don't even think that you can really miss if you click Portable Forge or Living Forge. You should be able to get something good for Shaco. He's good with melee artifacts like Death's Defiance, Infinity Force, Mittens. He's really good with assassin stuff, so Spectral Cutlass, Prowler's Claw. He's really good with range extension, so rapid fire cannon, sniper's focus, and fish bones. This guy might be goated when it comes to artifact usage, so you just really can't miss with him. Fantastic angle if you start off with the artifact anvil, or you just get like some kind of portable forge or artifact from loot subscription. Six Slayer is very core. Make sure you always play that. And then you duo carry Zed or Senna. You could go for Vayne 3, but again, Vayne's going to be contested a lot of times. Another higher level strategy at Challenger Plus for anyone who's like Masters and above, so this is only for like the advanced players who are watching this video. A lot of people actually remove items off of Shaco late game because it's so hard to get so many swords like Infinity Edge, Edge of Night, etc. And then you kind of want the same items on Zed. Really hard to actually get another set of these items. So a lot of times they actually move off things like Infinity Edge, Edge of Night, put that on Zed, and then give Shaco like whatever left over, like, you know, Bloodthirster and Quicksilver and just other things that you can't really get for, you know, the Infinity Edge and Edge of Night. And they make Zed and Shaco duo, but Shaco is like less about the primary carry and he's more like a support carry. Just like a small thing in case you're trying to find ways to optimize your win rate. But for the most part, Shaco's playing for top 4 and he's very good at that. Quick note about B tier before we go into it. Everything in B tier can do very well. It's just that it's one, less consistent than the S and A tier comps at his baseline performance. And 2, you kind of need to have like the right conditions for it. You need to have like either a specific item for a unit, like an artifact for Fiddlesticks. You need to have either something like an emblem for Golden Ox to really unlock its power, or you have to be like super far ahead, high rolling, or you need to have like, you know, the specific like reroll augment, so on and so forth. It's just way more conditional. And also, you still might just lose to the top tier comps anyways, even if you hit everything. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever play these compositions. It's just that they're much more rare, and you should be looking at the S and A tier comps more often. Taking a look at our first composition in B tier, we have Rengar Jinx duo carry. You play the Street Demon core, and you reroll for Jinx and Rengar as your primary carries. And you end up having a really tanky Rengar in the mid game, and then Jinx ends up being kind of your primary carry in the late stages of the game. In the ideal scenario, Jinx ends up having an Executioner emblem, so you don't have to play 2 Executioner for Rengar through like Varus or Vex. But, you know, if you don't have an Executioner, just put Infinity Edge on her, and that works perfectly fine. If you get a bunch of rods, just throw them on Brand, and Brand ends up being AP carry, and then if you get tank items, put it on Nico. Another variation that you can try to play is to trio carry Rengar, Jinx, and Varus. It's sort of combining both the Kitty Kitty Boom Boom version with the Executioner reroll. So you basically take Rengar, Varus, and then you combine that with this board, and then you play like 3 Executioner or 2 Executioner with 5 Street Demon instead, and you can roll for that on 7. And that's why things like Trifecta and Rig Shop can be very good in this composition. You can just replace Gragas. He's just there to help add extra frontline. Not really that important. This composition does end up struggling a lot in the late stage of the game. I think Rengar gets melted by Zeri. Like, once Zeri locks onto Rengar, she evades him, and she can just burst him with Hollow Bow. So this ends up being a really tricky matchup for Rengar. And with so many Zeris in the meta, that's partially why he's in B tier. But he's really good with artifacts still, so just give him the usual stuff. Silvermere Dawn, Powerless Claw, all the stuff. Still really solid, and Rengar can still terrorize a bunch of lobbies as long as you have Jinx in the back doing a bunch of DPS. Twisted Fate Reroll, this composition is so consistent at getting 3rds through 6ths, but it just feels so bad to play this composition and be so far ahead, and you just like lose out to everything in the late stage of the game. You pretty much are just the low roll bully. You just beat a bunch of comps that didn't hit, because you have a front line that can't die easily thanks to the ramping Gunblade healing from Twisted Fate. But you don't beat a lot of late game matchups as long as they hit. So he's like the ultimate gatekeeper. He just basically loses to everything here above him. And he even loses to a bunch of the B tier comps, but he beats them if they're even slightly behind tempo. So if you like being like an aggressive player that plays for top 4, get in, get out, get your plus 10, plus 15 LP, Twisted Fate's fine. Also, you know, if you have Rageblade and you can't angle for Zeri and you can't play for Vayne, you can just play for Twisted Fate, and everyone else is rerolling, so it makes your odds more favorable to hit. You can just do that. The other thing, too, is that there's other variations of Twisted Fate, so you don't have to play Skarner and Kog'Maw reroll. That variation is just really expensive and still not that good. So a lot of people like to play Rost and maybe just replace Kog'Maw with any other rapid fire, like Draven or Zeri. Or you can also play just 4 Vanguards and cut the 5 Syndicates and just play for a lower expensive version that you don't have to play around Misfortune with items. And instead, you can just play 4 Vanguard frontline. Whatever works, just get Rageblade, and Gunblade on Twisted Fate, and you're good to go. He's also really good with Zhonya's and Wit's End. Those are 2 really powerful artifacts. You could also play Grammar's Blade. Some variations, but for the most part, Twisted Fate, just like a attack speed carry, very similar to Kog'Maw in previous sets. Not this version's Kog'Maw, but in previous sets. As well as Bard, just like the typical double Rageblade, heal the front line, scale infinite attack speed, and watch your guy go pew pew. Golden Ox got a bunch of shiny buffs from Riot and is actually a really powerful late game composition now. When this composition wins, it wins really hard. It's actually very common for a 1 HP win out, similar to like a loose streak Cypher Cashout, or just get really far ahead early by hitting, you know, Golden Ox +1 into 4 Golden Ox early, print, push levels, hit early Aphelios because he's actually uncontested, and then just like snowball. And I've seen people at, you know, high level lobbies just like win with 75 HP, not even close. You can cap out with just any 5 cost. So really common thing is to actually drop Yuumi for Aurora and then play for, Viego Aurora plus any other 5 costs like Zac because you have so much gold. And then you end up putting a bunch of mana items on Annie, attack speed on Philios, and AP on Viego. So you have pretty much the whole suite of items that are taken care of. Tank can go in Leona or Jarvan, whoever you 2-star. And the nice thing is that you're playing the most uncontested 4 costs in the game. No one's out here buying Annie for the most part, unless they're just trying to play some weird variation strategists. No one is out here trying to play Aphelios because Marksman Vanguard is borderline C tier. I think this composition is the only viable way to play Aphelios consistently. And also, Anima Squad is struggling a lot. So you actually get these units basically for free. But it can be tricky to fit in 6 Golden Ox when you are playing on level 8. This is actually one of the hardest things about the comp is finding the toe of balance between 4 and 6. And 6 does matter because not only do you get a 100% chance to drop gold, but dropping components is really huge as well. It helps snowball your lead. So that's kind of why this has to be played from really far ahead and why you end up seeing a lot of people either dominate with it or play from really far behind and either first or 8th it. I would say that the main conditions for this composition are Golden Ox openers with either a training dummy or a Golden Ox crest or something like Golden Fleece, and you have a high chance of getting Graves 2. Graves 2 ends up giving you, really strong early game item holder. He's very good with, like Viego items. You can put like Edge of Night, Hodge, IE, even like Rageblade, Gunblade. Just put that all on Graves. That's totally fine. And then, or you can even give him tank items. You can give him like Sunfire, and then eventually move that over to like Leona Jarvan and work off of that. Very fun composition, very first or 8th. I try to play it whenever I can when I'm streaming because I just think it's super fun. But you also have to plan your Golden Ox turns pretty carefully. So definitely a high skill ceiling composition. And I think that the better people get at this line, the more impressive it's going to be. I secretly think its true power is somewhere around here, like around the brand. If you think brand is like a conditional win out comp, if you have the right setup for it, I think Golden Ox is similar to that. And I just think that we're like bad at the composition right now. So this is something that I think will continue to scale as we improve at the set. Nitro Reroll actually has a ton of potential. I think this composition can do very well. I myself have yet to figure out where are the optimal conditions for it, but I'm pretty sure that if you get the 3-star Nitro early, you can snowball this dinosaur and scale really, really fast. They adjusted Nitro a lot where the chrome stacking that you get off of the each round bonus ends up being way faster. It's twice as fast with 3 stars compared to 2 stars. And that's really intentional because they want you to 3-star Nitro units as opposed to playing for tempo Nitro. In the previous patch, you would just play 2-star Kindred, 2-star Nidalee, 2-star Shyvana, and you would get a really strong dinosaur anyways over time, and you can just play any 4 cost around it. But now you're super incentivized to hit Kindred and Nidalee. And if you are very close to hitting these 3 stars, you definitely want to roll and 3-star them because every round you're able to get those additional stacks is really important. Just remember that this robot T-Hex starts off really weak, and then you need to scale it quickly. The package that people are most playing right now are Naafiri and Jhin because Naafiri got a bunch of buffs. You could put Hyperfangs on Naafiri. I think Pulse Stabilizer is also really good on Naafiri. The data is very low sample size, so it's kind of hard, and I've only had like 1 or 2 games on this personally, but I've seen people win out with either Hyperfangs Naafiri or Pulse Stabilizer Naafiri, and then have Jhin hold the other half of whatever it is. Just duo carry for these 3 stars. Jhin is really contested though, so very hard to actually hit this guy. I think he's like the most contested 2 cost in the game. And good luck ever funding Sejuani. So this is very, very hard composition to pull off. You could try to play a variation that also carries Nidalee and Naafiri. So you have Nidalee hold things like Jewel Gauntlet, Bloodthirster Titans, and then Naafiri ends up being the duo. That variation also, I think, struggles into the mid game. But either way, this is a very unexplored comp that I think has a lot of potential, but that's why it's like in B tier. I think people have seen it do very well, but I don't think anyone has like the optimized version of it yet. One thing I do want to say is that this composition is actually really good at locking out some win out comps because there's actually a bug where this T-Hex against ghost boards, meaning that you fight against the player but not the real player, just a copy of their board, I think it stars up again for some reason. So if you have like a 4-star dinosaur at 300 stacks, it actually goes to like a 5-star unit of power, and it randomly just has 2.5x HP and 3x the amount of AD. It's just crazy. So it's actually really funny because if you end up in a 3-player scenario, and let's say one person's playing like a Cypher Cashout, what you end up having to do is your ghost ends up killing like the crazy Cypher Cashout player because your dinosaur is like a 5-star dino. It's actually ridiculous. So funny enough, this is a comp that's amazing at closing out games because you can just like cheese the 1-life players, even though they have insane boards. So don't be surprised. And also, if you're going up against it, there's nothing you can do. Just do your best not to lose by too many units. Try to kill the other units that aren't the dino. All right, let's do some quick hits here for the rest of B tier. Fiddlesticks is pretty much an artifact check or a Bruiser Emblem check. Even if you have Bruiser Emblem, not that amazing unless you're high rolling. It's a really expensive comp. It's a really conditional comp. If you can get everything, it's really powerful. I personally like Blighting Jewel the best on him. I think it's a really good setup. The true Exodia is Blighting Jewel, Archangels, and Bruisers. But other than that, it's just really hard to be consistent with this guy. So very high highs, pretty low lows. B tier seems correct for this. Roll on 7, look for Mordekaiser 3, Fiddlesticks 3. I mean, good luck hitting Mordekaiser 2 in this meta because this guy is extremely contested. So you might have to go for like Gragas 3 and you try to cap out either through extra Boombots or Renekton and Poppy. Strategist Amp can actually do very well, but the problem with this composition is that you somehow need to get to Samira 2 and Annie 2 and level 9 and then hit a very contested 4-cost front line, which is Nico and the Strategists. So you're just going to be really struggling all game. This is pretty much like the variation you play if you are either super contested on brand or you're just like low rolling a lot or you're just ambitious and you somehow hit Samira 2 and you have a bunch of AD items playing this line. If you can get the spot fully upgraded, does well. Anything besides Samira 2, Annie 2, Kabuko, Viego, and Nico 2, you're going to be struggling all game. So this is definitely a composition that can do well. Just, you know, you have to kind of have like these true fast 9 scenarios with $1 billion gold. And 500 items, and then you can really pop off and win the game. It's actually kind of like a 1st or 8th comp, but very much slanted towards 8th. Misfortune just can't keep up with reroll. I think her biggest problem right now is that she unloads her bullets, and these front lines that are 3-starred are impossible to kill. You're going up against Jarvan 3. She doesn't even deal 1/3 of her life, and then the units end up healing a lot, like the Slayers. She can't actually one-shot things like Shaco or Rengar. Zeri is highly evasive, so Misfortune won't finish her off either. She can do well if you're ahead. Again, it's off meta, so playing MF carry is nice because she is generally less contested, but your front line already is pretty sus, so I just don't think this is a very good comp in the meta right now. I think it's okay, but you have to sort of like be playing it from really far ahead, and you're playing for a top 4. Same thing with Marksman Vanguard. I find this to be the 4-cost variation of Twisted Fate. You play it, you go 3rd to 6th very often, you get out of the game as soon as possible, and you just try to make sure you're not going like 7-8 while contesting the same lines. It's something you theoretically could play for if you angled for Vayne and Twisted Fate and Zeri, and they were all gone. So you could just play, you know, Rageblade into Aphelios. Xayah takes leftover items. But it's just too weak at a baseline power level and too expensive, actually, because you kind of need to hit like Leona 2, Xayah 2, Aphelios 2 very quickly and then try to find that to get to 9. I do think this composition is kind of underrated now because I do think that it's less contested, even though Leona can be kind of hard to hit if people are playing a lot of Slayers. The reality is not everyone is going for Anima Squad as much. And so you should be able to hit more consistently if you are rich and you're ahead. It's just that you're rarely in the spot where this feels good, and it's just hard to recommend a composition that ends up capping out at like 3rd. Finally, I do want to address Anima Squad. I think a lot of people are very curious about it. I think that Anima Squad is performing really bad in the stats. It's averaging like a 4.9 at Challenger. And I think that one thing that people don't know maybe is that Anima Squad is currently bugged where you lose the power of your Anima Squad weapon if the unit dies. And that's a really big deal because part of the win condition for Anima Squad is that you do a bunch of damage and you hope that your weapon can deal damage every few seconds over the course of the fight. Units like Sylas, Alawi, Vayne, whatever die off, and then Leona and Xayah are the only 2 people alive, and then you do a bunch of damage. But if you lose 4, 5 units of your board and your weapon downgrades 4 to 5 tiers, ends up being way weaker. So I think that's why Anima Squad is doing really badly. That is just a rumor. I don't have confirmation that that's exactly what's happening, but either way, Anima Squad is really underperforming, so I would stay away from it this patch only because I don't think it's working as intended. That being said, being uncontested and hitting some of Anima Squad's best augments like Support Spire and Little Buddies and being in a position to play for it still can result in a pretty solid finish. It's not like unplayable, Putting things in C tier does not mean you should never play it. It just means that you're very rarely in a spot where it's really good and the stats are really bad for it. But I do think that out of all the C tier comps, this is the one that can be justified played the most. It's just that you're going to average a 5th or 6th really often because you fall off super hard and the composition can be really hard to hit. Hero augments haven't really changed much. I think that Kayn is still the best, and now that they buff Jarvan, you maybe just end up leaning more into Vanguards and 2 Slayers, but you can still just play like Vayne Reroll with Rost. It's like the same thing. You probably de-emphasize Vayne a lot. Like Vayne just takes whatever is left over. As you can see, we don't really go for best in slot since you really want Rost to have all the damage, and then you want to have like Zed as your duo. But you could also backline carry Senna, same thing. So pretty much just like a Slayer reroll comp, but just have Kayn as your melee carry into the Zed. Cease and Desist Vi is similar in concept, pretty much just like Kayn, but a little bit more on the defensive side. So you build like Bloodthirster Titans and Stairs Gauge with Vayne in the back, or Senna, or whoever you want. It's pretty flexible. You can actually even play like a Misfortune variation, like Braum Misfortune plus Twist of Fate or something like that in the back, and it works perfectly fine. And then the other hero augment that is actually okay-ish in the data is Gragas, only because if you go for 3-star Gragas and you hit Fiddle 6-3, it can't be that bad. You just have so much high-value units that you end up doing okay. Just go for like Bloodthirster Titans and Quicksilver on him and call it a day. I will say that I think these 3 other hero augments, Jax, Sylas, and Poppy, are all pretty terrible. Every single game I've seen of it or have played of it myself has been really disappointing. So I would just try to stay away from it. Even though they do have variations that could work, just go in knowing that you probably have low AVP. So there you go. That's the meta. Rageblade Slam, check for Zeri and reroll. Otherwise, look for Cypher. Otherwise, commit to a composition that you think is safe to play for placements, either like a Rengar reroll or look for some uncontested forecast and try to play for like that 4th, 5th range. Get your LP preservation, get out. Not my favorite patch of all time, but I also don't think it's like so horrendous that it requires a B patch. It's not like super impressive. Some people are comparing this to like the Callista Fairy Rakan patch where you get items off of the fairy. You play Rageblade. It's not that bad, but I do think that this patch could use a shake up. So I'm hoping, crossing my fingers for 14.3 to open up a lot more lines than just making it feel like you have to play some of these dominant Rageblade or reroll lines. That's it for me this video. Check out our guides section of TFT Academy for more in-depth stuff, updating a couple per week just to help get you guys up to speed on the current sets as well as the meta stuff. And if you guys have any other questions, please leave them in the comments below. Catch you guys next time.